Hello and welcome back to Advent. And I realize as I look at my face in this video that I look like that Ed Harris character from The Truman Show. So some of you will get that reference. Well, I'm filming this at the end of week 2 of Advent, which was the time we looked at our Bethlehem as our sacred place, which is the place of revelation. The birth narrative of Jesus, of course, reveals him. And I'm curious about your own revelation as you think about your birth narrative, how you think and understand and what you know about when you entered the world. Now, I got caught up on that third question about the spiritual birth narrative, and I thought about some things I hadn't thought about in a long time. And when I think about the spiritual birth, I think about my sophomore year of high school. I was raised in the church, I'm very fond of my church. But when I got to high school, I had one of my wild child friends drag me to this non-denominational group of a bunch of high school students led by a bunch of kind of wild college students. And I remember going thinking my main goal was not to look stupid, and I'm sure I failed at that. But it really kind of captured me because these college students talked about their faith in ways that I'd never been around before. They talked about faith in this very personal way, as if God, or especially Jesus, was like a friend, and blew my mind a little bit. I'd never thought about it that way. And so over the course of that year, I kind of wanted in on that and wanted to, what I talk about is kind of initiating and starting this relationship, this friendship with Jesus. And so I look back as kind of my spiritual birth at that time. And anyway, it was kind of fun for me to do. Well, now we move on to week 3. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are colors associated with Advent, and the 4 weeks go like this: purple, purple, pink, purple. And this is the pink week, week 3. This is all the pink I could find this morning. So the pink represents joy, and what happened in the probably medieval church is that the church had felt like it got a little too somber during this time. The rest of the culture was partying at the end of the harvest, and the church was being very introspective. And so what they did was they said, we need to lighten up a little bit. So they took the 3rd week of Advent, changed the colors from the somber purple to the joyous pink, decorated the church differently, and just kind of lightened up for a little bit. So maybe this will be a light week for you. Now, the 3rd week of Advent for our Sacred Place guide is going to be Jerusalem. And we're calling it the place of tradition. Now, Mike, my friend, writes this devotion, and it's fun to read about some of the history around Jerusalem, from the Bible especially. And so you'll enjoy reading that, and if it prompts you, go read a little bit further. And one of the things he will say is that Jerusalem was the kind of spiritual center for the Jewish faith, and still is, and there's a great beauty to that. But there's been periods where there's also been kind of a darkness around that. And he kind of likens that to our traditions. We inherit traditions, many of which are very beautiful, but there are times that you think, do we need to break from the tradition? Now, I had that in mind when I went back and read the nativity story found in Luke, and I'd encourage you to do that this week. Luke 1 and 2. Now, I'll start with Luke 2, which is when Mary and Joseph take their son Jesus to Jerusalem. Now, this is what all Jewish people did. In other words, the Holy Family followed tradition. At 40 days, Jesus, the firstborn son, gets presented to the Lord in front of a priest at the temple, and the mother had been ritually impure during the first 40 days. Kind of ironic that Mary was ceremoniously impure, could not interact with anything sacred and holy while she's cradling the Lord Jesus. But she went because that's what her tradition did. And because they went to Jerusalem and honored their tradition, they heard from God through the prophetic witness of a prophetess named Anna and the prophetic voice of an old man named Simeon. And you need to read that. It's beautiful and haunting. So the first thing is, when it comes to tradition, as you honor tradition, there are blessings that come with that. But sometimes you have to break with tradition because that's what God calls us to do. So in Luke 1, we have the story of Zacharias, familiar story. He is the father of John the Baptist. He is a priest, has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity as a priest to go to Jerusalem, to be in the temple, and to be in the holy place of the temple. The one time he got to do this, offering prayers and incense on behalf of the people. And of course, he's met by an angel, Gabriel, who tells him he's going to have a son as a forerunner for the promised one. And he says, you're going to name him John. Now, because of his unbelief, of course, he's unable to speak, and I think unable to hear, for the entire pregnancy. And finally, when day 8 comes of the baby's life, which is the time for circumcision and naming. Zacharias still can't speak, and so the people and the priests assume the baby's name will be Zacharias because that's the tradition. That's what you do after the firstborn son is named after the father every time. That's just how you do it. Elizabeth, the mother, says, no, we want to call him John. And they said, you can't do that. And they motion to Zacharias. He takes the tablet and says, his name is John. And as soon as he does that, his tongue is opened and he waxes beautifully in this prayer. So it's really fun to read about. But the point with that is he broke tradition, this old priest, because sometimes that's what God calls us to do. So with those two in mind, I think that's a great way to approach this next week. Mike talks about 4 different kinds of traditions as a metaphor, philosophical and intellectual and spiritual, and it'd be interesting to see what you do with those. But when I think about the traditions, religious and kind of traditions of your ethnicity and your family, are there ones that you need to honor or keep honoring or maybe rediscover? Like for me, Advent is a rediscovering of an old tradition of my family. We used to celebrate Advent at the church, and then, ironically, when I became a pastor, stopped celebrating Advent for about 2 decades. But then I've rediscovered it in the last 15 years, and that's just been beautiful for me. But sometimes you also need to consider breaking from tradition. And I mentioned this in my early story, is that the religious tradition of my family and my church was that faith is very private. You believed deeply, it affected how you live, but you kind of kept it to yourself. It wasn't a faith that you talked about with other people, and it was private more than it was personal. Well, as I told you my story, I got involved with some people in a community that kind of took what I had and went a little bit beyond that. That faith was not just private, it was personal, and that faith was not to be kept to yourself, but to be shared with others. And that was a break in my tradition, and a little bumpy one at the beginning. But that's what God called me to do, and there's blessings for that. So there's your assignment. Where's your Jerusalems in your life, traditions you want to perpetuate, and maybe there's a tradition it's time for you to break or tweak in some way that honors God. So I'll just end, since it is the 3rd week and it's about joy. I mentioned this earlier, but we'll do the famous stanza, joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Because that's where the real joy is. When you receive your King, that's where joy is. Have a joyous week, and we'll see you for 2 more, for week 4 and for Christmas Eve. God bless you.